Hi, I'm Nitin Sahani, and I'm a professor here at the New School. I'm really delighted here to be with my good friend and author, Josh Rubner, who just finished writing this extraordinary book called Shattered Hopes: Obama's Failure to Broker Israeli-Palestinian Peace. This is an exciting new book that Josh has been talking about for the past couple of months, and we're delighted to have him here at the New School to speak about it this evening. So with that, I'd like to have a conversation with Josh about this book. So Josh, what inspired you to write this book?
I was inspired to write this book because there were two massive leaks of official documents during Obama's first term that relate to this issue. Of course, there was WikiLeaks, which dumped millions and millions of US State Department cables into the public domain. And there was also a parallel leak from within the Palestinian negotiating team of documents and maps and meeting minutes from negotiations over the past 20 years that was leaked to Al Jazeera in 2011. And between these two sets of leaked documents, you really get quite an inside view of how US policy toward Israel and the Palestinian people is made, and what's wrong with it, to be quite honest. And that was part of the inspiration for writing this book, because these documents give behind-the-scenes backing to what we thought was actually going on, and shows how dramatically the United States continues to act as Israel's lawyer in these negotiations with Palestinians. In the words of the former peace process negotiator, Aaron David Miller, rather than acting as the honest broker that we really need to be. I think it was just the details showing the extent to which the United States is complicit in maintaining what I believe is a sham process, which is a process that's aimed not at ending Israel's apartheid policies toward the Palestinians, but rather try to construct a so-called peace, leaving these apartheid policies intact. And the documents revealed, thanks to WikiLeaks, show, for example, the extent to which the United States and Israel collude in the international arena to prevent Israel from being held accountable to the types of human rights standards and international law norms that we demand of other countries. So, for example, in the book I document how the United States effectively worked with the government of Israel to kill the Goldstone Report, which was written by the UN Human Rights Council after Israel's murderous assault on the Gaza Strip in 2008 and 2009. And these documents reveal that the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Susan Rice, was praising the cooperation with the government of Israel to, quote, blunt the effects of this report, and to make sure that Israel was not held accountable for the war crimes that were documented in this report.
Since being inaugurated, what has Obama done to really address this conflict? What has he done differently than his predecessors? Obviously, he appointed George Mitchell to a special team. How has that played out, and what have you felt has worked and has not worked through his first presidency, which is the topic of your book?
I think that President Obama entered the White House with a desire to try to change the direction of U.S. policy toward Israel and the Palestinians. I think he understood to a much greater extent than previous U.S. presidents that if there were to be any type of credible peace process between Israelis and Palestinians, then Israel had to stop colonizing Palestinian land on which they were supposedly negotiating a future Palestinian state. And he said this repeatedly and vehemently and quite forcefully at the outset of his administration. And this was, I think, the correct step one for reorienting U.S. policy toward this issue. The problem is that when Israel resisted and was backed by the pressure of the Israel lobby in this country, rather than confront it and spend some political capital to challenge it, Obama basically folded and reverted to the strategy of acting as Israel's guarantor in this quote-unquote peace process. And that is, in essence, why Obama was not able to make any progress toward Israeli-Palestinian peace in his first term.
We know that Obama entered this presidency with a lot of hopes, but many presidents before him have also attempted to solve the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, including Jimmy Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, many others. So what can you tell us about how they've handled this crisis and what aspects were successful or not successful in the ways that they handled them?
Yeah, I think there's a wide gamut of how different U.S. administrations have approached this issue, and some have been more willing than others to use the stick along with the carrot in terms of the mix of policy options and choices that they make available. So, for example, I think that in many respects, the policies of the Obama administration mirror to a great extent what happened during the Carter administration. So at the beginning of the Carter administration, President Jimmy Carter came out and was the first president to say that Palestinians needed to have a homeland, which was quite revolutionary when he said it back in the 1970s. And he took a lot of heat for that statement. And he also wanted to convene with the Soviet Union the Geneva Conference to resolve the entirety of the Israeli-Arab conflict on a multilateral basis. And this was Israel's worst fear, that the Soviet Union would be brought in and the United States would tag team with it to enforce a resolution to the conflict. So Carter did all this at the outset of his administration and then faced severe blowback from the Israel lobby for these positions and retreated from them and instead went into this bilateral peace-seeking mode of pursuing Egyptian-Israeli peace instead of a comprehensive Arab-Israeli peace. So there's that model. There's been other models. For example, President Eisenhower was very firm and insistent. And when Israel colluded with Britain and France in 1956 to invade Egypt and Israel occupied the Sinai Peninsula, not only did Eisenhower cut off all military and economic aid programs to Israel, and this was right before he was reelected, by the way, but he also told Israel privately that if you don't get out of Egypt right now, then I'm going to make sure that all private donations, charitable donations to Israel from the United States are cut off as well. And it took Israel a couple months to leave the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula after those quite forceful threats were made. So those, I'd say, would be the edges of the spectrum in which different presidents have operated on this issue, and most of them somewhere in between those two ends, I'd say.
Now, clearly, before Obama became president, both President Clinton and Bush made some attempts at trying to address the crisis in Israel-Palestine. What can you tell us about what worked and didn't work in those administrations, and what did Obama learn to do differently in his presidency?
Well, I don't think there were too many successes under either president in terms of advancing Israeli-Palestinian peace. Under Clinton, at the outset of his administration, the Declaration of Principles was signed between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization in September 1993. This was the document that created this 5-year, quote, peace process, in which there were supposed to have been a number of interim steps taken. For example, Israel redeployed from some Palestinian cities that it occupied. The Palestinian Authority was created. There were presidential and legislative elections for the first time in Palestinian history, et cetera, et cetera. The problem with this process is twofold. Number one, under this process, Israel used it as a pretext for really going on an unprecedented expansion of its colonization of Palestinian land. And the second problem was that the so-called permanent status issues, the issues that lie at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, like the status of Jerusalem, the fate of Palestinian refugees who were exiled from their homes, the sharing of water resources, where to draw borders, security arrangements, etc. All of these things were never negotiated upon when they were supposed to have been negotiated. Instead, Israel kept deferring these negotiations until Camp David in 2000, when Israel and the United States attempted an all-or-nothing, go-for-broke type of negotiating session, which failed. And the ramifications of that failure of that negotiating session, I think, are still playing out today in many respects. Now, Bush had this broken peace process that was overdue, and quite frankly, he tried on a couple of occasions to restart it. He sent George Mitchell out in 2001 to give him a report on how to restart these negotiations. And in 2003, he came up with a, quote, roadmap on how to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But there was never any pressure on Israel to end its colonization of Palestinian lands. And there was one, I would say, serious attempt at negotiations during the Bush administration in 2007 in Annapolis, and the process after that. But in the end, he wasn't able to make any progress either. And in fact, Obama on the campaign trail was highly critical of both Clinton's approach and Bush's approach. And he said that if I'm president, I'm not going to wait till the end of my term, like Clinton and like Bush, to try to resolve this. I'm going to attack this head on at the outset of my administration, which is why on his second day in office, he appointed George Mitchell as his special envoy for Middle East peace, and he placed the resolving of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict really at the top of his foreign policy agenda.
What preceded Obama's inauguration in his presidency? I believe there was a very important event that happened in the territories where Operation Cast Lead was forced upon the Gazans by Israel and had many ramifications. What do you think was the consequence of that when Obama became president, and what did he do about it?
Right, there was a major Israeli attack upon Palestinians in the blockaded Gaza Strip in December of '08 and January of '09. And this was timed very crucially to the U.S. electoral calendar and the U.S. holiday calendar, as I document in the book. Israel actually broke the ceasefire that it had with Hamas in the Gaza Strip. It was either the day of or the day before Americans went to the polls to elect Barack Obama as president. So when the entire attention of the world was turned to this historic U.S. presidential election, Israel broke the truce with Hamas and then launched this major attack on the Palestinian Gaza Strip in the week between Christmas and New Year's in the United States, when the Bush administration was a lame duck and the Obama administration had yet to come into office. Now, in the course of 3 weeks, Israel massacred more than 1,400 Palestinians in this conflict, the vast majority of whom were civilians, including hundreds of children. And this presented quite a dilemma, not only for the Bush administration, but for the incoming Obama administration. And as I document in the book, there were discussions back and forth between the Bush White House and the Obama transition team and the Israeli embassy on the timing to end this brutal attack.
So what happened then? So they actually ended it right before Obama's inauguration?
Yes, the bombs stopped falling about a week after the UN finally passed a ceasefire resolution, which the Bush administration did not veto, and the bombs stopped falling a couple days before Obama was inaugurated.
Did Obama take any steps to address Operation Cast Lead or the issues around there? Were anyone in his administration involved in fact-finding or any kind of justice around that?
Well, as I document in the book, there was a lot of pressure exerted on him to say something about Operation Cast Lead during this transition period, but he refused to do so. He said, there's only one president at a time, and I'm not going to speak on foreign policy issues. Meanwhile, though, there was this attack in Mumbai at the same time, and he had plenty to say about that attack. So it was clear that Obama was being very selective in terms of the foreign policy issues that he would address, yet he promised that he would address this issue of the Gaza Strip immediately upon assuming office, and he did, but not in a good way, because what he did was, instead of holding Israel accountable for the war crimes that were committed in the Gaza Strip with U.S. weapons in violation of U.S. law, he actually approved the delivery of 300 containers full of ammunition and weapons to Israel just a couple months later.
There was no humanitarian relief provided to Gazans?
There was. Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, helped to convene an international conference in Egypt, and the United States pledged, I believe it was $800 or $900 million, part of which went to reconstruction in the Gaza Strip, ostensibly. But as we see from the cables in WikiLeaks, the United States was actually quite aware that Israel was making the blockade even tougher in the aftermath of this attack and making it impossible to deliver the humanitarian needs and the reconstruction needs that the United States was trying to put money into.
So only a fraction of that ever made it to the Gaza Strip?
I'm not sure how much actually made it, and you can see cables that were cabled back to the State Department in Washington, in which the U.S. interlocutors with the Israeli government officials are really questioning them about what they're letting in, and they're clearly not buying the rationale that Israel is trying to put forward, that we can't let in things like cement and so forth to rebuild Gaza because those would be potential weapons. You see in the documents that were leaked in WikiLeaks that the United States just wasn't buying that privately.
I noticed during Operation Cast Lead, one of the congressmen who did go visit Gaza on his own was Senator John Kerry. And it was quite remarkable to see him there with his wife, Teresa, on a private visit to see what happened. And it was very touching when I saw that. Now, years later, seeing Senator Kerry as in his new role trying to mediate this conflict, I wonder, Josh, what you think about his sensibility in solving this as intentionality, and how he might be effective and how he might be different from his predecessors in trying to deal with this.
I think John Kerry, as a senator and as the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was actually much better on this issue than he is today as Secretary of State. He was very much affected emotionally by what he saw in the Gaza Strip, as I recount in the book from public statements that he made at the time. But since he's become Secretary of State, to be honest, I think he's a bit in over his head on how to address foreign policy. I think he's making a number of gaffes foreign policy-wise, whether we're talking about Syria, whether we're talking about Egypt, and especially if we're talking about how he's handling current Israeli-Palestinian negotiations.
Can you tell us about his approach to that, and how different is it from his predecessors?
So in the first Obama administration, at the outset, there was a legitimate attempt to try to get Israel to halt its colonization of Palestinian lands. And when that attempt failed, and the Obama administration didn't leverage any political pressure on Israel to actually enforce a cessation of colonization efforts, at least the Obama administration had the pretense that they were still trying to get Israel to stop colonizing Palestinian land. This time under Kerry, there's not even a pretense that we're trying to get Israel to stop. So in August, a few weeks after these negotiations were relaunched this summer, a reporter asked John Kerry, after Israel had for the upteenth time announced the expansion of its settlements in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, do you expect that Israel is going to continue to do this while these negotiations are taking place? And Kerry said something to the effect of, yes, we understand that Israel is going to continue to announce the expansion of these settlements while these talks are taking place, but we don't want that to be an obstacle to their success.
I find that one state and binational states really interesting as a proposal. What has held them back from serious consideration in the international community? Why aren't we talking about those as viable solutions to be considering, instead of remaining caught up in the never-ending process of a diminishing two-state solution?
Right. It's part of the straitjacket in which U.S. policy is in right now that prevents that kind of honest discussion of alternative paradigms for how to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it's a paradigm that not only the Palestinian negotiating team continually insists on, but Israel insists on as well. But they have very different understandings of what a Palestinian state would be. So whereas when the Palestinian negotiating team talks about a Palestinian state, they understand it in the terms that you and I and every other human being on the planet would understand the concept of statehood. control over your borders, the ability to have an independent foreign policy and enter into treaties and control the water and land and air about your state. But this is not Israel's conception at all. Israel's conception is to put Palestinians behind fragmented, disconnected walls and settlements and Israeli-only bypass roads and so forth that would basically turn the West Bank permanently into what the Gaza Strip is today, which is an open-air prison without any attributes of sovereignty for this so-called state. So even the language about what a two-state resolution entails is very much in conflict between the sides. But I think as this process breaks down with this impending spring deadline, you will see more serious discussion about alternative paradigms, even within, I think, mainstream U.S. policy circles.
Since Obama's re-election last year, he's taken some important steps, at least at the surface, to bring Kerry to the fore and have him lead the negotiations around Israel-Palestine. But Obama is mired in issues around his healthcare law, the economy, and our presence in Afghanistan. How much bandwidth does he really have seriously to dedicate to this? And what can we hope to see in the next few years? Are we at a stage where we need to look beyond this administration and think about a post-Obama context within which the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will be resolved?
I think so. I think this is the last college try by the Obama administration. I don't think they're going to try to pick up the pieces after this latest round of negotiation fails and try again. I think they are going to say that we've done the best that we could and we're simply letting the next administration handle this issue. So I think creative thinking about how the next administration should deal with this issue should be done starting now.
A lot of people think that the next president may well be Hillary Clinton. And what do you think could be her approach in her presidency, given her experience in the past? How would things change any differently?
I think that circumstances on the ground will eventually force reconsideration. I think the impending demise of the two-state resolution is going to greatly increase international pressure on Israel to end its apartheid policies toward the Palestinian people. And I think that the only thing that is keeping Israel today from becoming an international pariah like South Africa was in the 1980s is this sham peace process. And when it ends, I think Israel is going to find it very, very difficult. It's already finding it very difficult, but even more difficult to sustain the notion that it's a democracy. Because it's not a democracy. It's an ethnocracy. It's a country that grants political rights to Jewish Israelis, but for Palestinians over whom it rules, they either have very circumscribed political rights or no political rights whatsoever. And the collapse of this peace process, two-state paradigm will, I think, bring that into sharper relief and change the dynamics of how U.S. administration has to deal with this issue. I still think it's going to be very difficult to do because even after South Africa had reached that point where it had become an international pariah, you did have a small South Africa apartheid lobby in this country, but nowhere near the extent of the Israel lobby today. So the existence of that lobby is going to make it infinitely more difficult and complex to reorient U.S. policy in a fundamentally different direction.
We've talked a lot about how the U.S. administration has handled this and their relationship with Israel. But obviously this is a multilateral issue, and there are many parties, including the international community with France, Germany, the Gulf countries, and the halls of the UN. What can you tell us about the ways that they have been a part of this, effectively or not? And how has the UN been involved, and what has the U.S. done to deal with this in the halls of the UN?
Yeah, in the book I document how the Obama administration systematically shoved aside anyone else, any other actors who wanted to try their hand at Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking or who had alternative viewpoints for how to resolve the conflict. So for example, there was an initiative by France in the summer of 2011 to sort of head off what was an impending diplomatic disaster for Israel and the United States at the UN when Palestine applied to become a member. And Hillary Clinton made it very clear that France, even though it wanted to convene an international conference, and even though the United States admitted that it was out of ideas for how to resolve this impasse, refused to let France have a crack at it. There's also more explicit documents from within the Palestinian negotiating team where the UN Special Rapporteur for the peace process expresses frustration at the Americans for sidelining the UN from this process. And indeed, that's exactly how Israel wants it. Israel doesn't want any other actors at the table. Why? Because the United States is Israel's lawyers in these negotiations, as Aaron David Miller, the former peace process negotiator, admitted in 2005. And this suits Israel very well. So it's to Israel's interest to keep this situation where the United States simply elbows aside any other actor who tries to come into the picture.
One interesting case study about the UN has to do with UNESCO and funding for the UNESCO. And we actually saw an article about that just this week of how the US has lost its voting rights in UNESCO after 2 years of defunding it. Can you tell us about what happened there and why it happened?
Sure. In the aftermath of Palestine applying to become a member of the UN, a move which was blocked by the United States in the Security Council, what the Palestinians did was to turn to subsidiary agencies of the UN and ask for membership. So one of the subsidiary agencies that did so was UNESCO. And in October of 2011, UNESCO voted overwhelmingly to admit Palestine as a full member of the organization. Now, what this did was that it triggered two very arcane pieces of US legislation from way back in the late 80s, early 90s that said that the United States had to defund any UN organization that recognizes Palestine. Now, Obama's hands were tied because the law did not allow for the president to waive this sanction on national security grounds like most sanctions legislation does. So the Obama administration kind of lobbied Congress to change these laws, and they're kind of doing it now as well, that we've lost our voting rights in UNESCO. But what happened was that this triggered the United States' immediate curtailment of its budget payments to UNESCO, which account for 25% of the organization's budget, affecting things like education and early warning systems for tsunamis and other things that are in the interest not only of the United States, but of the world as well. And so we're beginning to see some of the repercussions of this UNESCO defunding play out now that the United States can no longer vote there.
Now, two important players in this who are part of Obama's administration are Susan Rice and Samantha Power. And they have both been ambassadors to the UN during his first and second term. How do you think they've both handled their role and representation in the UN? They both come from different backgrounds and different interests. What can you tell us about their approach?
So Susan Rice was the U.S. ambassador to the UN in Obama's first term, and she played a seminal role in taking the lead in many, many Obama administration efforts to protect Israel at the UN, as she wholeheartedly gloated about in public. And in fact, she has a very close personal, emotional connection to Israel, which she often talks about when she's speaking in front of mainstream Jewish American organizations, which I quote from in the book. She, I think, was a key player in understanding, and especially through WikiLeaks, we see this even more clearly, exactly how the Obama administration protected Israel in the UN, prevented it from being held accountable. Now, Samantha Power is very different because when she was first involved as an advisor to the Obama campaign team, she was actually a lightning rod of criticism from the Israel lobby, because during the Second Palestinian Intifada, she had made some fairly innocuous comments about how there should maybe be an international protection force for the Palestinian people. And this was deemed outrageous by the Israel lobby. And so she kind of repudiated those comments, but as she was nominated to be the U.S. ambassador to the UN in Obama's second term, she repudiated any critical remarks that she had made about Israel over the entirety of her career. And it was a moment of genuflection before the Israel lobby in the Senate, very similar to what Chuck Hagel did when he was nominated to be Secretary of Defense in Obama's second term. So any thoughts that Hagel or Power might have had about adopting a different policy toward Israel, those thoughts were completely neutered by this really grotesque spectacle of them going before the Senate and groveling and pandering to try to lay out their pro-Israel credentials.
I heard just yesterday that Samantha Power was also the keynote speaker at the Anti-Defamation League's major conference, and had very wise words to say about their approach and what they're doing, without similar words for what the Palestinians deserve and need. So I think we're also facing a situation where Samantha Power can no longer have this kind of unbiased, critical voice in the UN, and it's something that happens to almost everyone who ends up in that place.
Yeah, I think that's a real key to understanding why the policy remains as it is, despite individuals perhaps holding personal ideas and explanations and motives that are different from the official policy. And I think this explains to a large extent Obama's vacillation, or more accurately, his repeated climb downs during his first administration, because it's not about personalities. As I try to make clear in the book, we have a system of government in which lobby groups set the parameters of acceptable debate in this country. And the Israel lobby is no different from the gun lobby in terms of how it works to constrain politicians' options. So regardless of what your personal thoughts are, you're right. By the time you get into those positions of being defense secretary or U.S. ambassador to the UN, or even president of the United States, you can't necessarily act on your convictions because it doesn't jibe with what the lobbies are pursuing.
We've talked a lot about how the U.S. government has handled this crisis, but what role do you think civil society has in building awareness, in changing the terms of discourse around this? You, Josh, have been part of the National Advocacy. Josh, let me pause. Josh, you've been the National Advocacy Director for the U.S. campaign to end the occupation. And in your role, you work with hundreds of member groups all around the country. What are they doing, and how effective are they in really dealing with this issue? What can we hope to see civil society do that would turn the dynamics of this conflict?
I think there's every reason to be optimistic about civil society's ability to change the parameters of debate, change the politics of the situation, etc. And I think we've already seen a huge shift in how the mainstream media relates to issues of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for the better. It's still not great, but it's better than it was 5 years ago, with Palestinians and Palestinian Americans and those of all backgrounds who support Palestinian human rights to get entree and access to the mainstream media to a degree that they weren't able to prior to that. So things are changing. In fact, in the book, I document how the executive director of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee spoke in very alarming terms at an AIPAC conference a few years ago about how it was becoming, quote, an ordinary political discourse to discuss Israel as an apartheid state, to engage in campaigns of boycott, divestment, and sanctions against it, and how these campaigns were entering mainstream institutions, college campuses, religious organizations and institutions, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the same slope down which apartheid South Africa slid in the 1970s and the 1980s. And I think the Israel lobby sees the writing clearly on the wall, that civil society is tired of relying upon U.S. politicians to broker Israeli-Palestinian peace, because they are not going to do it. They can't do it. They're incapable of doing it on the current parameters of the peace process, because, as I mentioned earlier, this peace process is not about ending Israeli apartheid, but about consolidating it. So civil society, I think, understands more and more that we, the people, have to take action to change the situation. We have to pressure our politicians to pursue a different policy, and we also have to respond to what Palestinian civil society is asking us to do to help them lift the boot of Israeli oppression off of their necks. And that's to engage in campaigns of boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel until it respects and implements Palestinian human and national rights.
Now, what role do we have in the academy, within the universities, to do something around this conflict? What have we been doing in the past, and what can we do today to really affect the terms of the debate?
Yeah, I think universities played a crucial role in helping to bring about an end of apartheid in South Africa. And I think that college campuses are, again, at the forefront of engaging in policies that will set about a different paradigm that will ultimately lead to a just and lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians. So a number of student senates have passed resolutions asking their regents to divest their money from corporations that are profiteering from Israeli military occupation. And Hampshire College in Massachusetts actually moved money out of corporations that were such engaged. So these type of developments are happening on college campuses. The Israel lobby is spending millions and millions of dollars a year to try to counteract and defeat what's a very grassroots, very underfunded movement, and it is not succeeding. And there's sort of, I think, a sense of a snowball rolling down the hill at this point. That I wouldn't say it's inevitable, because nothing is ever inevitable in terms of social change, but these campaigns are gaining more and more momentum despite the huge amount of pressure that's brought to bear to kill these initiatives on campuses.
So Josh, let me just close by asking you, what would you hope people would get out of reading this book?
I think if people take away something from this book, it's that we, as U.S. citizens, because we fund the weapons that Israel misuses to oppress the Palestinian people, and we're responsible for protecting Israel in the United Nations and make sure that it's never held accountable for its actions. I hope the book inspires Americans of all backgrounds to realize that we are all collectively responsible for enabling Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people, and that it's up to us to change our government's policies so that that oppression is not enabled anymore, and so that we're no longer complicit in Israel's human rights abuses against Palestinians.
This was a great conversation, Josh. Thank you for coming to the New School, and I wish you luck getting this book out and widely disseminated. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.